Spectacle muttered under his breath as he and his allies ran toward the rock which had been thrown. Spectacle threw the rock in the air and muttered under his breath, before noticing the large boulder Carmack and Syndicate were hiding behind. They did not, however, notice that Stretcher had run up the mountain and was only 50 meters from their location. Spectacle and Icarus ran behind a boulder and lifted a screaming Syndicate and Carmack up in the air. Spectacle laughed as he slapped Syndicate across the face, which caused her to fall to the ground. Icarus brought his knee into Carmack's stomach, which caused Carmack to yell in pain and stumble. Emerald walked towards Syndicate and kicked her in the face, which caused laughter from the couriers. Aurelia placed an arrow in her bow and pointed it at Syndicate, before asking her where Stretcher was. Stretcher appeared in the clearing and hid behind a tree as the couriers continued taunting Syndicate and Carmack and asking them for Stretcher's whereabouts. As Syndicate and Carmack refused to give them information, Spectacle threw an immature tantrum and threatened to stab the pair with his sword, yet they did not change their expression, and Spectacle moaned, before grinning and saying he knew thousands of creative ways to kill them. Stretcher, who had a spear at the ready, appeared angry by this and threw his spear into Spectacle's back. The spear went straight through the center of Spectacle's back and he fell sideways to the ground. His cannon went off before he had even hit the ground, and Icarus laughed as he noticed Stretcher walked in with his axe. Icarus quickly blocked Stretcher's attack with his sword, before shouting at Aurelia and Emerald to follow Syndicate and Carmack, who were now fleeing. The girls both nodded and chased the other two, who had burst through the other end of the clearing. Icarus licked his lips and blocked Stretcher's attack with his sword once again, before grabbing the axe and pushing it towards Stretcher's face. Icarus, who looked as determined to kill as ever, used all of his strength to push the axe towards Stretcher. However, Stretcher was just as muscular as Icarus and managed to push the axe away. Icarus threw the axe, but Stretcher ducked in time and the axe hit a tree. Icarus swore as Stretcher grabbed a rock, yet as he was grabbing his sword, Stretcher slammed a rock into the side of his head and ran off. Rubius gasped as Icarus was knocked unconscious and lay motionless on the ground. Rubius and Priscilla waited for his cannon to sound, yet no cannon rang out and no blood spilled from his right temple, where the rock had hit him. Stretcher continued running while panting in fear, and repeating Syndicate and Carmack's names. Stretcher began glancing around frantically and screeched their names once more. Just then, Emerald leapt out from behind a tree and threw a knife at Stretcher's leg. Stretcher gasped in pain and staggered backwards as Emerald crossed towards him. As he bent down to examine his leg wound, Emerald reached forward and slapped Stretcher as hard as he could. Stretcher staggered back as Emerald kicked him in his wound. As Stretcher groaned and began whimpering, Emerald began laughing and spoke about how she had always wanted to kill a 12. This enraged Stretcher, and as Emerald snarled at him, Stretcher held his axe tightly. Emerald jumped towards him, and Stretcher swung his axe into her stomach. Emerald screamed and collapsed to the ground, which made Stretcher swing the axe into her stomach several more times. Spectacle sprinted away while shouting for Carmack and Syndicate. Aurelia burst out from behind a tree and ran after him for a few moments, but then noticed Emerald crying in pain. Icarus slowly regained consciousness and joined Aurelia, who was now standing directly above a whimpering Emerald. Icarus and Aurelia stared at Emerald, and she asked them not to kill her. Icarus discreetly winked at Aurelia, before telling Emerald they would not kill her. Emerald shakily got to her feet, but then cried out and fell back down, holding a bleeding stomach in pain. Icarus helped her to her feet, before putting an arm around her neck and telling Aurelia to do the same. The pair told Emerald they were going to take her back to their camp and treat her wounds. After a few minutes, Icarus moved in front of Emerald and let her balance herself, which seemed to work. Icarus looked at Aurelia before nodding and saying the trees were like District 2 in springtime. Emerald immediately realized what was about to happen, yet she was too late, and Aurelia fired an arrow into her back. Emerald staggered forwards, and Aurelia fired a second arrow at her back, which caused her to fall at Icarus's feet. Icarus gave a self-satisfied smirk, before bringing his sword down on Emerald's neck, which sounded her cannon. Icarus and Aurelia began kissing against a nearby tree, before jogging away from the clearing as the hovercraft retrieved Emerald's body. As they returned to their camp, they noticed the sun was beginning to set. Icarus yawned and said it had been a long day, and began to sleep. Just then, a sponsor gift could be heard coming towards them, and they both grinned as they saw it was some baked ham. Icarus told Aurelia he ate this occasionally during lunch in the academy, and she smiled, before cutting a piece of ham with some of Emerald's knives for herself. As the pair began eating, they congratulated each other and the sun fell below the horizon. As Icarus began sleeping, an announcement was made by Game Maker Friend. Game Maker Friend told the tributes that a feast would take place at 6 in the morning the following day and would contain food and water and possible weapons and supplies for them. Icarus sniggered and told Aurelia that they had to go to the feast in order to kill more tributes. Meanwhile, Stretcher and Syndicate agreed not to go to the feast, yet as soon as they had fallen asleep, Carmack held his dagger and approached them. Although he was clearly about to kill him, Carmack appeared to have second thoughts, and he placed his knife in his pocket and ran in the direction of the cornucopia. As midnight came around, the portraits of Spectacle and Emerald, both from 1, Islanda from 4, Fonio, and the girl from 9 were shown, which left just Icarus and Aurelia, both from 2, Drape from 8, Carmack from 11, and Stretcher and Syndicate, both from 12, still alive. Carmack spent a few hours trying to reach the cornucopia, yet the trees disoriented him and he took several wrong turns. Stretcher and Syndicate were still asleep and subsequently did not notice that Carmack had abandoned them. Icarus and Aurelia woke up whilst the sun was still below the horizon. Icarus grabbed Aurelia's arm before taking his sword and her bow and arrow and running in the direction of the cornucopia. Aurelia could be heard saying, "Victory, victory," under her breath, whilst Icarus's face was extremely determined as he increased his pace. The pair swam towards the cornucopia and arrived rather early, and hid behind a large boulder meters from the cornucopia. As he observed the dome timer, Icarus noted that there were still 4 minutes left until 6, and so he relaxed a little. After 4 minutes, the feast bags rose into the arena. Carmack sprinted inwards from the forest and lunged towards the bag titled 11, before grabbing it and fleeing. However, Aurelia jumped out from behind a rock and fired an arrow at his chest. Carmack yelled and twisted around before falling to his knees and pitching forward, still alive. Aurelia snarled and walked toward the gasping Carmack. Just then, Drape leapt down from the roof of the cornucopia, where he had been hiding. Drape grabbed a bag labeled 8 and tried to get away, yet Icarus grabbed him from behind and frowned. Drape cried out and used his muscular arms to try to push Icarus away. He managed to do this, and Rubius muttered underneath his breath. Icarus groaned and grabbed his sword before chasing Drape. Icarus chased Drape towards the water, and although Drape was extremely fast, Icarus caught up with him and threw him in the water. Drape gasped for breath as Icarus grabbed his head, before plunging it under water and grabbing his arm, so that he could not defend himself. Drape began struggling underwater as Icarus maintained a firm grip on his neck. Icarus plunged Drape's head deeper underwater until his cannon finally sounded. Icarus rested for a few seconds, but heard Carmack's groans. Icarus joined Aurelia, who was now grinning at Carmack. She asked him where Stretcher and Syndicate were hiding, yet he refused to say anything. Icarus appeared to get angry and aimed his sword at Carmack's neck, before repeating what he and Aurelia had just said. Carmack continued refusing, which angered Icarus even more. Icarus muttered "torture" to Aurelia, and she fired an arrow at Carmack's hand, which pinned him to the ground. She fired an arrow at his other hand, which left him unable to move his hands. Icarus repeated his question, which made Carmack shout that Stretcher and Syndicate were resting a few clearings away from the courier's camp. Icarus grinned and said, "Why, thank you," before plunging his sword into Carmack's neck, which sounded his cannon. Icarus opened District 2's feast bag and grinned when he found 2 grenades. He carefully gave one to Aurelia and placed the other in his pocket, before grabbing his sword and jumping into the water. The pair swam to the end of the lake within a few minutes and pulled themselves up onto the land. Icarus and Aurelia gave each other a brief nod before turning their attention to the forest. Meanwhile, Stretcher and Syndicate were awoken by Drape's cannon. Stretcher immediately asked where Carmack was. Yeah, just then they heard his cat scream from the cornucopia. Stretcher swore and muttered, he went to the feast," under his breath. He told Syndicate that they had to run, and just then the outlines of the District 2 tributes could be seen killing Carmack. Stretcher swore once again before grabbing Syndicate and beginning to run. By now, Icarus and Aurelia had reached the land and were pulling themselves up. Icarus, who had trained his entire life for this moment, began running after Stretcher and Syndicate as fast as he could, which happened to be extremely fast. Aurelia tried to run as fast as Icarus, yet within a few moments it became clear Icarus was faster than her. Icarus grinned as he noticed Aurelia behind him, before shouting at her to "Get the girl!" Aurelia nodded and picked up her pace just as Icarus overtook Stretcher and slapped him in the back of his head. Due to Icarus' strength, Stretcher staggered, and he shouted for Syndicate to run. However, it was at that moment Syndicate heard Aurelia jump on her back, and she fell into the ground. Both District 12 tributes screamed while the District 2 tributes showed out in victory and laughed. Icarus noticed Stretcher get back to his feet, and he grabbed him by the neck from behind. Stretcher placed his hands around Icarus' arms and tried to fight him, and put up a rather decent fight. As the cameras focused on Icarus' surprised face, Rubius announced that Icarus was not used to District 12 putting up a decent fight. This seemed to be true, as Stretcher quickly kicked away Icarus' sword, which was on the ground. Icarus angrily pushed him away before grabbing his sword and charging towards the coughing Stretcher. Stretcher tried to block the sword with his hand, but due to the sharp blade of the sword, this hurt Stretcher's hands. As Stretcher grabbed his axe, a cannon went off. Meanwhile, Aurelia and Syndicate had begun fighting intensely. As the girls rolled around on the ground fighting, Syndicate tried punching Aurelia as hard as she could. Aurelia angrily grabbed Syndicate and twisted her hand around, which caused her to scream. Aurelia grabbed Syndicate and slammed her head into the ground before kicking her in the stomach. Aurelia, who was now clearly desperate to survive, fired an arrow at Syndicate's heart before turning her around, grabbing the same arrow and plunging it into her back. She turned her around once more and slammed the arrow into her chest and neck several times before kicking her away as her painful groans were silenced and a cannon sounded. Both Icarus and Stretcher looked up in shock, wondering whether it had been Aurelia or Syndicate who had been killed. Stretcher began sobbing and looked Icarus in the eye before asking Icarus if he really wanted to murder innocent children. Rubius swore and told Priscilla that Stretcher was trying to distract Icarus. Icarus suspiciously eyed Stretcher before telling him that he did not enjoy killing, but that he had taken lives already in creative ways. Stretcher told Icarus that he knew that deep down there Icarus wasn't a killer, but a scared, manipulated boy. Icarus looked at Stretcher before telling him he did what he had to do and had always wanted to win and make Dad proud. Stretcher shook his head before muttering that Aeneas Dalton had been a monster, but that Icarus still had a chance to live a nice life. Icarus angrily told Stretcher that he was the manipulator and was trying to win by using psychological combat. Icarus then laughed and said psychological combat was one of the topics discussed in the Dalton Elite. Icarus gave Stretcher a puzzled expression before saying he was right about killing and embraced him. Stretcher smiled, but did not notice Icarus grabbing his sword. Icarus lifted it and jammed it into Stretcher's back, which caused him to cough blood and sounded his cannon. Aurelia heard this cannon and muttered, "Icarus or the 12," under her breath. As the hovercraft came to collect the bodies of Syndicate and Stretcher, the pair from two moved in opposite directions in order to make way. As the bodies were lifted into the air, both of them gave a painful groan, knowing they would have to fight each other. Icarus held his head in his hands before whispering "why" under his breath. Aurelia groaned once more before grabbing her bows and running back to where she had just killed Syndicate. Icarus ran the same way and raised his sword just as Aurelia fired the arrow she had used to kill Syndicate at him. Icarus raised his sword in defense, which caused the arrow to bounce off. Icarus sprinted away towards the cornucopia, and Aurelia, only a few meters to his right, chased after him. As Icarus was extremely fast, he reached the elevated section of the forest within minutes and began climbing. Aurelia reached a few moments later and began climbing after Icarus, who was still muttering "why?" The pair began climbing after each other for a few more minutes, until Icarus performed a backflip and landed on top of the mountain. Moments later, Aurelia followed and fired another arrow at him. Icarus blocked the arrow with his sword as he approached her, blocking the arrow she fired at him. As Aurelia examined her last arrow, she smiled sadly at Icarus before saying "sorry" and firing it at his stomach. He was too late to dodge it and he cried out before falling to his knees and holding his stomach in pain. Icarus winced before asking Aurelia if they really had signed up for this. Aurelia grimaced before repeating what she had just said and grabbing Icarus by the neck. She pulled him to his feet and said, "Only one can win." Icarus quietly reached for his sword with his leg, which was noticed by Aurelia. She only noticed when it was too late, and Icarus kicked the sword into his hand before slicing it across Aurelia's stomach. Aurelia cried out and Icarus smiled sympathetically at her before saying, "Exactly, and it should be me." Aurelia staggered whilst Icarus held his stomach in pain, and he told her that he did not want to kill, but he wanted to bring pride to his district. He told her that, being the son of Aeneas Dalton, his ego was rather big. He leaned forward and kissed her, before saying sorry and cocking his head. He grabbed her by the hair and threw her down the mountain and into the water. A tear rolled down his cheek as he watched Aurelia hit the water and her cannon sounded.